Hey everyone, my name's Tanner Wells and I'm 29 years old. Right now, I run an event planning company here in New York City. The city lights here truly never dim, always sparkling like endless stars. The streets are constantly buzzing with activity, yet there's a certain chill to it all, making you feel like just a small part of this massive urban swirl. I really love my job putting together these elaborate parties and grand events for VIPs, where every single detail has to be perfect. But deep down, I know I'm running. I'm running from the immense shadow of the Wells family and from memories of my grandfather, some warm, some painful. I grew up in Greenwich, Connecticut, a town where grand mansions often hide behind ancient oak trees, perfectly manicured green lawns, and those classic white picket fences that look like they're straight out of a painting. Greenwich is definitely a symbol of wealth, but for me it always felt a little empty. My parents divorced when I was young. I was only 7. My mom, a gentle woman with sad eyes, just couldn't handle my father's overbearing nature. Wells, the oldest son of the Wells family, a powerful dynasty with a long history, starting with my grandfather Frederick Wells. He founded a huge real estate and finance company. When my mom left, she left me in that enormous, cold mansion. The only sounds were my father's footsteps and the silent tensions between him, Uncle Philip, and Aunt Elaine. The Wells family isn't just a name, it's an empire. My grandfather, Frederick, built the foundation with his massive real estate and finance conglomerate. Starting in the 1960s, he turned empty land into luxurious city developments, built skyscrapers in Manhattan, and created investment funds that commanded respect in the financial world. My grandfather was a tall, strong man with incredibly sharp eyes that seemed to see right through everything. But to me, he wasn't just some legendary businessman. He was the one who taught me how to tie a fishing line, how to balance on a snowboard, and most importantly, how to live without being blinded by money. My memories of my grandfather are the brightest parts of my childhood. I remember early mornings, right as the sun was coming up. He'd take me to the lake behind the house to fish. He'd sit on a folding chair, his baseball cap tilted, telling stories from his youth about starting from nothing and working day and night to build the company. Tanner, he'd say, his voice deep and steady as a rock, money is a tool, not a purpose. Don't let it control you. Just nod, not fully understanding then. I just loved sitting there beside him, listening to the water shimmer in his booming, laugh when I caught my first fish. In the winters, he'd take me skiing in the Adirondacks. I can still feel the biting cold, the snow clinging to my face, my gloves soaked. But my heart was always warm because he was there, shouting encouragement every time I fell and got back up. Keep falling, Tanner, he'd say, but never stay down. Get up and try again. Those words have stuck with me my whole life. Not. Everything in my family was as warm as that. My father, Conrad, was the main heir to the Wells Company. He was a stern man, always in a black suit, hair slicked back, with cold eyes that seemed to weigh every decision of those around him. He ran the company with an iron fist, and I always felt he saw me more as a project than a son. Uncle Philip, my father's younger brother, was the opposite, a charming man, always smiling and talking. But I knew behind that smile there was always calculation. Aunt Elaine, the youngest sibling, was a sharp woman, always appearing in expensive dresses with ambitious eyes. All three held important positions in the company, but I never felt close to them. They lived in a world centered around power and money, while I just wanted to escape. I grew up with conflicting emotions. On one hand, I was so proud of my grandfather and what he had built. On the other, I hated how my father, uncle, and aunt ran the company, the tense meetings, the fake handshakes, and the smiles that hid underlying competition. I wanted no part of that empire. When I went to college, I chose to study business, but not to take over the family company. I wanted to build something of my own, something that wouldn't be overshadowed by the Wells dynasty. That's why I started my event planning company in New York. At first, it was just small parties, but gradually I started making a name for myself. I love the feeling of being behind the scenes, watching everything come together perfectly, the lights, the music, the smiles on the clients' faces. The work keeps me busy, but it also helps me keep my distance from my family, especially my father. He wasn't happy with my choice. "Tanner," he once said, his voice heavy with disappointment, "you're wasting your potential. This family needs you." But I didn't need that family, at least not in the way he meant. Still, the memories of my grandfather remain a flame that warms me. I remember one time when I was 15, he called me into his study at the family estate. The room smelled of pine wood and old books, with paintings of ships crossing oceans hanging on the walls. He sat behind his desk, looking at me with serious but warm eyes. "Tanner," he said, "one day you'll face difficult choices. Remember doing? The right thing is always harder, but it will let you sleep soundly at night." I didn't fully grasp his meaning then, but those words echoed in my mind like a prophecy. I didn't know that just a few years later those words would become a guiding compass through the darkest days of my life. But before everything fell apart, before the horrifying secrets of my family came to light, my life moved forward under the glittering lights of New York and the sweet memories of my grandfather. I thought I had it all: a career, an independent life, and big dreams. But I didn't realize that deep in my heart, I was still searching for something, an answer to the voids I had never dared to face. And then everything changed on that fateful day, the day my grandfather disappeared. I still remember it vividly, a winter morning when I was 23, with the New York sky draped in a heavy leaden gray. I was in my small office, just starting out with my event planning company, when the phone rang. My father's voice, cold as always, came through the speaker. "Tanner, your grandfather is missing in Colorado. The rescue team is searching." No further explanation, no trace of emotion. I stood frozen, gripping the phone tightly, feeling as if the ground beneath me had collapsed. My grandfather, Frederick Wells, the man as unyielding as a mountain, had vanished during a skiing trip in Colorado. He loved those snow-covered slopes where he once taught me how to glide on a snowboard and get back up after every fall. This time he went alone, which was rare. He usually preferred company, whether it was me or an old friend. The initial report from the rescue team said he was caught in a sudden blizzard. Colorado storms can swallow anyone, even someone as experienced as my grandfather. But I couldn't believe it. Not my grandfather, not the man who always had a plan for everything, who once told me every step must have a purpose. I flew to Colorado that same day, clinging to a fragile thread of hope. When I arrived, the biting cold cut into my skin, but the chill in my heart was far harsher. The rescue team had scoured the mountainsides, from familiar trails to deep, treacherous ravines. They found his snowboard snapped in two, lying alone near a cliff's edge. A torn glove was also discovered, stained with dried blood, but there was no trace of him, no other clues. It was as if he had dissolved into the storm. The days that followed were a nightmare. I stayed in Colorado, joining the search efforts, ignoring the freezing cold that numbed my limbs and the howling winds that seemed to tear away every shred of hope. My father, Uncle Philip, and Aunt Elaine were there too. But they weren't like me. My father stood there, his face rigid, directing the rescue team as if he were chairing a board meeting. Uncle. Philip was restless, constantly checking his phone as if more concerned about some business deal than about my grandfather. Aunt Elaine, with her sharp eyes, spoke in curt sentences. "We've done all we can." I looked at them and wondered why none of them seemed as broken as I was. Why could they stand there so composed while my heart felt like it was being ripped apart? After 2 weeks of relentless searching, the rescue team called it off. "There's no hope left," they said, their voices flat like reading a report. The police concluded, "Missing 'cause unknown." No signs of foul play, no evidence beyond the snowboard and the glove. The media began to buzz. Frederick Wells, billionaire tycoon, lost in a blizzard. Some tabloids even spun ridiculous stories that he was kidnapped by a business rival, or that he deliberately vanished to live a reclusive life. Each word I read made my blood boil. He didn't know my grandfather, the man I was certain would never abandon his family, would never leave me without a goodbye. The family decided to hold an annual memorial on the day he went missing. Memorial took place at the family estate in Greenwich, where I grew up. The grand mansion, with its marble columns and Persian rugs, now felt like a tomb. Guests arrived in droves, from business partners to my grandfather's old friends. My father stood to speak, his voice low and somber, but theatrical, as if performing a carefully staged role. Frederick Wells was a father, a leader, a legend, he said, and the crowd nodded and clapped. But I just sat there clutching my glass of wine, feeling like a stranger in my own home. I couldn't stand how they turned our family's loss into a hollow social event filled with empty laughter. I returned to New York right after the ceremony, trying to bury my pain in work. My company began to grow. Bigger contracts came in, and I gradually made a name for myself in the event planning industry. Every night, as the city lights dimmed, I found myself sitting alone, thinking of my grandfather. I wondered what he felt in his final moments. Was he afraid? Did he call out my name? I couldn't accept that he was gone, but I didn't know what else to do except believe the official conclusion. The storm had taken him, and I had to learn to live with that. My relationship with my father grew even more distant. We were never close, but after my grandfather's disappearance, things got worse. He wanted me to join the Wells conglomerate, to take a leadership role. "This is your legacy," he said, his voice heavy with expectation. But I didn't want it. I didn't want to live in the world he, Uncle Philip, and Aunt Elaine controlled, a world full of calculations and pretense. Our arguments grew fiercer, to the point where we went months without speaking. I built my life in New York, trying to create a world of my own, where I didn't have to face the shadows of my family. But deep down, I knew I had never truly let go. Every time I saw a baseball cap like the one my grandfather used to wear, or heard someone mention Colorado, my heart would ache. I kept a photo of him in my wallet, him standing by the lake holding a fishing rod, his smile as radiant as the sun. That's how I wanted to remember him. Not through newspaper articles or hollow memorial ceremonies. As the years passed, I grew accustomed to the pain, but it never fully disappeared. It was like a scar, always there, reminding me of the man who shaped who I am. I thought I would continue living like that, carrying the memory of my grandfather like a silent companion. But I didn't know that 5 years later, a horrifying secret would shatter everything I had ever believed, pulling me back to Greenwich, back to that mansion, and forcing me to face the dark truth about my family. In 2023, my life turned a new page. I married Ava, the woman who brought light back into my world. Ava was unlike anyone I had ever met. She was an architect with glossy brown hair, always tied up high and eyes so bright they seemed to speak. She had a way of seeing the world that was both practical and inspiring, as if every building, every wall, told a story. Our wedding took place at a luxurious hotel in Manhattan, an event. I organized myself with twinkling lights, white orchids, draped across the hall and the laughter of hundreds of guests. Standing there, holding Ava's hand, I felt like I had finally found a place where I belonged. But even in that moment of happiness, I felt a void. My grandfather wasn't there to see me grow up, to see me happy. Early in 2024, I decided to bring Ava to Greenwich for the 5th annual memorial for my grandfather. It was her first time at the family estate, and I wasn't sure I was ready for her to step into that world. As we drove through the large iron gates, Ava squeezed my hand, her smile gentle. "It's more beautiful than I imagined," she said, eyes sparkling as she looked at the perfectly trimmed rows of trees. I just nodded, trying to suppress a sense of unease. I didn't want her to see the dark side of my family, but I knew I couldn't hide it forever. The memorial was held in the grand hall of the estate, where Persian rugs stretched across the floor and crystal chandeliers glittered like stars. Guests arrived in droves, as they did every year, from business partners of the Wells conglomerate to my grandfather's old friends. My father, as usual, stood up to speak, wore a black suit, his hair slicked back, his voice rising and falling like a stage actor. "Frederick Wells was the guiding light of our family," he said, his eyes sweeping over the crowd. "His legacy will live on." I sat in the front row next to Ava, but I felt like I was in another world. Everything here was too perfect, too staged, like a meticulously rehearsed performance. Uncle Philip stood in a corner of the room, holding a glass of wine, laughing and talking with a group of business partners. Aunt Elaine, in a striking red silk dress, moved through the crowd, shaking hands with a sharp smile. I looked at them and wondered why none of them seemed truly grieving. 5 years had passed, but the pain of losing my grandfather still tore at me every day. And them? They were either acting, or they had truly forgotten him. Ava, sitting beside me, seemed uncomfortable. She squeezed my hand lightly and whispered, "Everything here. It's like a theater stage." I nodded, feeling like she had just voiced what I'd always thought but never dared admit. After my father's speech, everyone began moving to the dining room where an elaborate feast was prepared with exquisite dishes and expensive wines. I led Ava around the estate, showing her the corners where I used to play as a child, the library with its towering bookshelves, the garden with its fountain, and the hallway leading to my father's study. As we passed through a side hall, Ava suddenly stopped. She looked up at the marble wall, then out to the courtyard, where moonlight illuminated the meticulously trimmed bushes. "Tanner," she said, her voice low but resolute, "something's not right here." I frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" She pointed at the wall. "The dimensions of the house, they don't add up." I laughed, thinking she was joking. "Ava, I lived here for nearly 20 years. If there was something strange, I'd know." But she didn't smile. She paced, taking long strides, counting steps from the inner wall to the courtyard outside. "Tanner, I've been an architect for over 10 years. I know how to read spaces. There's a gap. It could be a hidden room." I froze, feeling as if someone had poured ice water over me. A hidden room in the house I grew up in. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. It's probably just the design. Old houses like this have spaces for structural support or something. But Ava stood firm in her conviction. On the drive back to New York, Ava kept talking about her discovery. She explained the architectural discrepancy, how the walls could conceal a hidden space. I listened, but a storm of emotions raged in my mind. I wanted to believe her, but the idea of a hidden room in my own home sounded like something out of a horror story. Then, like a bolt of lightning, a memory flashed in my mind. It was a few weeks before my grandfather disappeared. He called me into his study, as he often did, but this time his tone was more serious. He spoke about changing his will. "Tanner," he said, his eyes pensive, "I've lived long enough to see what money can do to people. I want the majority of my wealth to go to a charitable foundation. My children, they won't be happy, but it's the right thing to do." I nodded, not thinking much of it at the time, but now that memory was as sharp as a blade. My grandfather disappeared. Just weeks after that conversation, I gripped the steering wheel, my heart pounding. "Ava," I said, my voice trembling, "if you're right, if there really is a hidden room, could it be that my grandfather didn't disappear? Could it be?" I couldn't finish the sentence. The thought that my father, Uncle Philip, or Aunt Elaine might have locked my grandfather away to control his fortune, it was too horrific. But once that thought crept into my mind, it wouldn't leave. Ava placed her hand on my shoulder, her voice steady. "Tanner, we need to find out. If there's any chance your grandfather is still alive, we can't ignore it." I looked into her eyes, seeing a burning determination. And in that moment, I knew I had to investigate and uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. In the days following the memorial, I couldn't stop thinking about the hidden room Ava had discovered. The thought that my grandfather, the man who taught me how to tie a fishing line, how to get back up after every fall, might still be alive, locked away somewhere in the very house I grew up in, made it impossible for me to sit still. Every night, I lay in bed staring at the twinkling lights of New York City through the window. But they couldn't dispel the darkness suffocating my heart. Ava, with her architect's keen eye, kept sketching the layout of the house, pinpointing the mysterious space on the first floor near my grandfather's study. "Tanner," she said, her voice full of resolve, "we have to act, but we need more information before we do anything." I knew there was only one person who could help us. Mary, the nanny who had cared for me since I was a child and still worked at the family estate in Greenwich. Mary was a rare light in my lonely childhood years, always telling me fairy tales, baking cookies, and wiping my tears whenever my father was too harsh. If anyone knew something about the house's secrets, it had to be her. But I also knew that if my father, Uncle Philip, or Aunt Elaine were truly keeping my grandfather captive, they wouldn't let Mary reveal the truth easily. A few days later, I decided to return to the estate. Ave wanted to come with me, but I convinced her to stay in New York. If we both show up, they might get suspicious, I said. I need to do this alone first. Ava didn't like the idea, but she eventually agreed, reminding me to bring a small notebook to jot down any details Mary might share. I drove to Greenwich, my heart heavy, as if carrying the weight of the world. The estate loomed before me, still, magnificent with its white marble columns and stained glass windows. But now it felt more like a prison than the home I once loved. I found Mary in the spacious kitchen where the faint smell of cinnamon cookies lingered just like in my childhood memories. She was wiping down the counter, her silver hair neatly tied back, her wrinkled hands moving slowly, down when she saw me. She smiled, but the smile couldn't hide the anxiety in her eyes. "Tanner, are you here for a visit?" she said, her voice warm but slightly trembling. The memorial the other day was so elegant, wasn't it? People still talk about Mr. Frederick. I cut her off, not wanting her to deflect. "Mary, I'm not here to talk about the memorial." Stepped closer, looking directly into her eyes. "I need the truth about my grandfather, about the hidden room on the first floor." She froze, her hands stopping mid-wipe, her eyes flashing with panic as if I had just touched on a horrifying secret. "Tana, what are you talking about?" she whispered, her voice so soft it was barely audible. "Don't ask about those things. Not safe." I sat down on an old wooden chair in the kitchen, trying to keep my voice calm but unable to hide the urgency. "Mary, I grew up in this house. I know every nook and cranny. But Ava, my wife, she noticed a space on the first floor that doesn't add up. I remember what my grandfather said about changing his will, about the charitable foundation, and then he disappeared. If you know anything, please tell me." I took her hand, her trembling cold hands clasped in mine. My grandfather was the best person I've ever known. He taught me how to live, how to be a man. If he's alive, if he's locked away, I can't abandon him. Mary bowed her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Tanner, you don't understand, she said, her voice choked with emotion. "They won't forgive me if I tell. They'll kill me." My heart tightened. Who was she talking about? My father, Uncle Philip, Aunt Elaine. I gripped her hands tighter, my voice low, but insistent. "Mary, I'll protect you, I swear, but I need to know the truth for my grandfather." After a long silence, she looked up, her eyes filled with pain. "Mr. Frederick, he didn't disappear in the storm." Her words pierced me like a knife. Ava was right. Felt the blood in my veins turn to ice, but I forced myself to stay calm, waiting for her to continue. "They, Mr. Conrad, Mr. Philip, and Miss Elaine, they locked him away in a hidden room near the study. I was forced to care for him, to bring food and water through a small slot in the false wall. They threatened to kill me if I told anyone." I gripped the chair tightly, trying to contain the rage erupting in my chest. "Locked him away his own children?" Mary nodded, tears streaming down her face. "They didn't want him to change the will. They wanted to keep the fortune, not let it go to the charitable foundation. I begged them to let him go, but they wouldn't. Listen, that room, it has a surveillance camera and an electronic lock. Only Mr. Conrad and Mr. Philip know the code. If I brought you or anyone unfamiliar near it, the system would lock all the doors and send an alert to Mr. Conrad." I felt as if the world was crumbling around me. My grandfather, the man as strong as a mountain, locked away like a prisoner by his own children. I wanted to scream, to run to that wall and tear it down, but I knew I had to stay composed. "Mary," I said, my voice trembling, "I'm going to find a way to save my grandfather, but I need your help." Mary nodded, warning me not to approach the hidden room through the main entrance under any circumstances. I left the estate, my mind spinning as if caught in a whirlwind. On the drive back to New York, I called Ava, recounting everything Mary had revealed. Her voice over the phone was tense but resolute. "Tanner, we can't go to the police yet. Mary's words, as heartbreaking as they are, aren't enough for proof. If your father gets an alert from the system, they might move your grandfather, or worse." I gripped the steering wheel knowing she was right. "So what do we do?" a mix of helplessness and burning anger raging in my chest. "We need a plan," Ava replied. "We need to act fast." Back at the apartment, Ava had spread a large sheet of paper across the dining table next to a steaming cup of coffee and her laptop. She had contacted a friend from architecture school who had access to Greenwich's city building records. "Send me the original blueprints of the estate," Ava said, pointing to the laptop screen. The blueprints appeared, detailed down to every wall and pipe. Ava zoomed in on the first floor, near the study, where Mary had described the false wall. Here, she pointed to a blank space on the blueprint. "This room isn't labeled, but it exists. The false wall hides it." I stared at the blueprint, feeling like I was looking at a map to a horrifying truth. Ava continued, her voice steady. "We can't go through the main door because of the electronic lock and surveillance camera. But if we break through the wall from the outside, near the garden, we might bypass the security system." I nodded, picturing the false wall hidden behind the large tapestry Mary had mentioned. "But how do we avoid being detected?" I asked. "The estate has guards, and if my father gets an alert, ... Ava cut me off, her eyes lighting up. "Does your father have any upcoming business trips? If he's away, we'll have a window." I recalled my father's schedule. He frequently traveled to Chicago or London for board meetings with the Wells conglomerate. "Next week," I said. "He's going to Chicago for 3 days. Uncle Philip and Aunt Elaine usually go with him." Ava smiled, a determined smile. "That's our chance. 3 days with no one watching closely. We'll get in, break the wall, and save your grandfather." We began preparing. Ava printed out the blueprint, marking the exact location of the false wall from the garden side. I drove to a hardware store in Brooklyn, buying a sledgehammer, a high-powered flashlight, and a set of metal cutters. I carefully hid them in the trunk of the car, my heart pounding every time I thought about the plan ahead. Ava suggested bringing a handheld camera to record everything. "If we find your grandfather," she said, "we need clear evidence. The footage will prove he was held captive, and no one can deny it." I nodded, feeling her intelligence and determination fueling my own resolve. The days waiting for my father's trip felt like a nightmare. Every night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, imagining my grandfather chained in a dark room. I remembered our fishing trips by the lake, when he'd laugh heartily and pat my shoulder, calling me kiddo. Remembered him teaching me to ski, shouting encouragement every time I fell. The thought that he had been locked away for 5 years, frail and alone, crushed my heart. I wondered if he thought of me, if he hoped I'd come to save him. And then I thought of my father. He was cold, domineering, but he was my father. Could he really do something so horrific? I didn't want to believe it, but Mary's words echoed in my mind, sharp as a blade. The night before my father left Ava, and I sat down to review everything one last time. Sledgehammer, flashlight, metal cutters, handheld camera, everything was ready. Ava spread out the blueprint again, showing me the precise location of the false wall from the garden. "We'll go in at midnight," she said. "The guards usually patrol early, but they get lax afterward. We only have one shot, Tanner." I nodded, feeling like a warrior preparing for battle, but also like a scared child facing the truth. The day my father left Greenwich, I received a short text from Mary. "Your father's gone to Chicago. Act soon before he returns." I stared at the message, feeling a weight like a stone in my chest. My father had no idea I was about to unravel the secret he'd kept hidden. That night, Ava and I drove to Greenwich. The sky was pitch black, with only faint moonlight filtering through the oak trees. The estate loomed, silent and cold. In a secluded corner near the back fence, and quietly entered through a side gate, my heart pounded. Every small sound, the rustle of leaves, the chirping of insects made me jump. Ava led the way, holding the blueprint and flashlight. She stopped. In the back garden, where the rose bushes still bloomed despite the cold, "Here," she whispered, pointing to a marble wall concealed by ivy. "The false wall is just behind this. If I'm right, the room is inside." I nodded, pulling the sledgehammer from the bag. Before starting, I looked at Ava, feeling like I was standing at a fateful crossroads. "My grandfather's in there," I said, my voice choking. "We'll bring him home." Ava took my hand, her gaze unwavering. We'll do this, Tanner. I raised the sledgehammer and struck the wall hard. The loud thud, like thunder, startled me. Ava shone the flashlight, watching as debris fell. I kept swinging, each strike fueled by anger, pain, and hope. Suddenly I heard footsteps. A guard appeared, his eyes wide with panic. "Mr. Tanner, what are you doing?" he stammered. I turned, my voice cold. "I'm the owner of this house. I'll take responsibility. If you try to stop me, you'll regret it." Step back, clearly intimidated by the fury in my eyes. He stood there, not daring to intervene, only pulling out his walkie-talkie to call someone, likely another guard in the estate. After several minutes of relentless hammering, the wall began to crack. I used the metal cutters to slice through the steel bars inside. Finally, a section of the wall collapsed, revealing a dark void. Ava shone the flashlight inside, and my heart stopped. There, in a small room, my grandfather lay on an iron bed. His hands and feet chained, frail and pale, his hair and beard white as snow. But his eyes, those sharp eyes, I remembered, still shone as brightly as ever. "Who's there? Is that Tanner?" he whispered, his voice weak, but filled with emotion. I couldn't hold back, rushing to him and kneeling by the bed, tears streaming down my face. "Grandfather, it's me." I hugged him tightly, feeling his frail body in my arms. He gripped my hand, his eyes glistening. "My boy, you finally found me. I've been waiting for you all these years." We held each other, tears mingling, in a moment of reunion I hadn't dared to dream of. Time seemed to stand still. I held my grandfather, feeling his faint breaths against my shoulder, each one a testament that he was still alive, that I hadn't arrived too late. The small secret room, with its cold walls and musty smell, was now filled with emotion, pain, hope, and unbridled anger. I looked at him, his white hair disheveled, his face gaunt, and his frail hands chained to the iron bed frame. It's the man who was once as strong as a mountain, who taught me to get up after every fall, now lay here, imprisoned by his own children like a criminal. My heart felt crushed, torn between the joy of reunion and an anger I couldn't contain. Ava stood behind, me holding the camera, recording the entire scene. I saw her both stunned and moved, her hands trembling, but keeping the camera steady. Her eyes glistened with tears, but she didn't let her emotions take over. "Tanner," she whispered, her voice choked, "we have the evidence now. Everything's recorded." I nodded, knowing this footage would be the key to exposing the crimes of my father, Uncle Philip, and Aunt Elaine. But at that moment, I just wanted to focus on my grandfather, to ensure he was safe. Outside, the guard still stood there, mouth agape, his eyes wide with panic, as if he couldn't believe what was happening. He stepped back a few paces, his trembling hand reaching for his walkie-talkie, but he seemed unsure of what to do. The noise from the collapsing wall had drawn attention, and soon Mary and a few other staff members and guards rushed over. They froze at the sight. Frederick Wells, the patriarch of the Wells family, lying in a secret room, chained like a criminal. A young maid covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face. An older guard muttered, "Dear God, what is this?" Oh, Mary knelt by the door, her trembling hands covering her face, her voice choked with sobs. "Mr. Frederick, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, sir." I turned to see Mary weeping uncontrollably. She stepped into the room, kneeling beside my grandfather's bed, her hands clasped as if in prayer. "Mr. Frederick, please forgive me," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't want to do it. They forced me. I tried to tell them it was wrong. But they threatened me, threatened my family." My grandfather, though frail, reached out to touch her shoulder, his voice weak but full of compassion. "Mary, I don't blame you. You did what you could. My ungrateful children. They're the ones who must pay." His words, though weak, carried the strength of a man who had never let money cloud his judgment. I looked at him, feeling the fire of his resolve still burning, despite the toll 5 years of captivity had taken on his body. I pulled out my phone, my hand shaking as I dialed 911. "Hello, this is an emergency," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need an ambulance immediately at the Wells estate, Greenwich, Connecticut." My grandfather, he's been locked up, held captive in a secret room. He needs medical attention now. The dispatcher asked a few questions to confirm, but I cut them off, my voice urgent. Please hurry. I turned to Ava, seeing her still recording, her face wet with tears, but her eyes resolute. Tanner, the police will be here soon, she said. We did the right thing. While waiting, I smashed the lock with a sledgehammer, then carefully removed the chains from my grandfather, each cold iron link falling away like a symbol of liberation. He gripped my hand, his eyes shining despite his frail condition. Tanner, he whispered, you're my pride. I knew you'd find me. I choked up, unable to form words, only holding his hand tightly, feeling the faint warmth from the hands that had guided me through cold winters. Just 15 minutes later, the wail of ambulance sirens mixed with the sound of police cars echoed in the distance. Flashing red and blue lights illuminated the garden, casting a glow on the rose bushes in the dark night. The police arrived quickly, securing the scene. An officer who seemed to be in charge stepped into the room, his eyes unable to hide his shock. What's going on here? He asked, looking from my grandfather to me and Ava. I recounted the story briefly, my voice trembling. My grandfather, Frederick Wells, has been locked in this room for 5 years. I have proof. I pointed to the camera in Ava's hands. Officer nodded, signaling his team to start collecting evidence. Paramedics rushed in, carefully placing my grandfather on a stretcher and checking his condition. He was weak, his breathing uneven, but still alert enough to speak to the officer nearby. I am Frederick Wells, he said, his voice weak but clear. My son Conrad, along with Philip and Elaine, locked me in here for 5 years to stop me from changing my will. His words were like a verdict, powerful and uncompromising despite his weakened state. I followed the ambulance, holding my grandfather's hand. Ava stayed behind to work with the police, handing over the footage and explaining everything. Watching my grandfather on the stretcher, I felt both relief and pain. Relief that he was alive, that I had found him. Pain from the horrific truth about my family. My father, Uncle Philip, Aunt Elaine, the people I once called family, had betrayed the man who meant the most to me. But now I knew I had to be strong for my grandfather, for the truth, and for myself. The ambulance sped through the snow-covered streets of Greenwich, its red and blue lights flashing in the dark night. I sat beside my grandfather, holding his hand tightly, feeling his frail fingers lightly squeeze mine as if promising he was still here, still fighting. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunk in, but his gaze remained sharp, like a flame that never went out. Tanner, he whispered, his voice weak, but full of resolve. You did what I always believed you could. I choked up, unable to respond, only gripping his hand tighter as if afraid that letting go would make him disappear again. At Greenwich Hospital, doctors and nurses rushed my grandfather into the emergency room. I stood in the hallway, watching through the glass as they checked his heart rate, measured his blood pressure, and started an IV drip. Female doctor, her expression serious yet empathetic, stepped out and spoke to me. He's severely malnourished and dehydrated, but he's stable. We'll run a full battery of tests to assess his condition thoroughly. I nodded, feeling as if a weight had been lifted from my chest, though worry still clung to me. Will he be okay? I asked, my voice trembling. She gave a small smile. He's a strong man. We'll do everything we can. Ava arrived at the hospital about an hour later, bringing the video footage and a copy of the estate's blueprints she had given to the police. She hugged me, her eyes still red from tears shed at the estate. The police have seen the video, she said. They're working with the investigation team to finalize arrest warrants. I nodded, but inside, a storm of emotions raged. My father, the man who always demanded I live up to the Wells legacy, was now a criminal. The thought filled me with both anger and pain. After a few hours, when my grandfather had stabilized, a detective, Lieutenant Harris, came to meet us at the hospital. He was a middle-aged man with graying hair, his sharp eyes tempered by a lack of coldness. Mr. Frederick is alert enough to give a statement, he said. We need you and Miss Ava present to clarify some details. We entered the hospital room, where my grandfather lay on the bed, an IV line in his arm. He still looked frail, but his eyes were brighter, as if his liberation had breathed life back into his body. My grandfather began to speak, his voice weak, but clear, like a man determined to let the truth be known. "I was kidnapped during a skiing trip in Colorado," he said, his gaze fixed on Lieutenant Harris. "I thought it was just a normal trip, but then I was attacked, drugged. When I woke up, I was in that secret room in my own family's estate." He paused, taking a deep breath as if the memory still caused him pain. "My son Conrad, along with Philip and Elaine, locked me away. They wanted to stop me from changing my will. I've planned to put most of my wealth into a charitable foundation, but they wanted to keep it all for themselves. They locked me up waiting for me to die so the old will, dividing the estate equally among them, would remain valid. They're listening, feeling as if my heart was being crushed. Each word was a dagger, but also a beam of light, exposing the horrific truth I had suspected. Ava held my hand, her eyes full of empathy, but also determination. Lieutenant Harris took careful notes, nodding occasionally. "We have the video from Miss Ava," he said, along with the statement from Mary, the housekeeper. "Mr. Frederick's health condition is also clear evidence. We have enough to press charges: unlawful imprisonment, elder abuse, and criminal conspiracy." I looked at my grandfather, seeing him nod slightly, his eyes resolute. "Make sure they pay," he said, his voice low but powerful. "They don't deserve any part of the company." His words were a verdict not just for my father, Uncle Philip, and Aunt Elaine, but for the misguided values they had pursued. At the same time, the police moved swiftly. My father, Uncle Philip, and Aunt Elaine were arrested at JFK Airport as soon as they returned from their 3-day business trip in Chicago. I imagined them being handcuffed, their faces filled with shock and panic as they realized their secret had been exposed. The media erupted that night with sensational headlines. Billionaire Frederick Wells rescued after 5 years of captivity by his own children. Public outrage flooded social media with posts condemning the cruelty of my father and his siblings. The Wells family, once a symbol of wealth and power, had become the center of a horrific scandal. In the weeks that followed, my grandfather gradually recovered in the hospital. Ava and I stayed by his side every day, bringing him his favorite foods: cinnamon cookies, like the ones Mary used to make, and the hot tea he loved. One afternoon, as sunlight streamed through the hospital room window, I received word from Lieutenant Harris. My father, Uncle Philip, and Aunt Elaine had been indicted. The trial moved quickly with undeniable evidence: Ava's video, Mary's testimony, my grandfather's health condition, and documents seized from the estate, including security logs from the electronic lock system. The court delivered its verdict. My father received a 15-year sentence for unlawful imprisonment and elder abuse. Uncle Philip and Aunt Elaine each received 12 years for complicity and criminal conspiracy. I sat in the courtroom watching them bow their heads before the judge, feeling as if a painful chapter of my life had closed. But not everyone in the family had turned their back on my grandfather. His grandchildren, my cousins, the children of Uncle Philip and Aunt Elaine, came to visit him in the hospital. They lived and worked in Europe, and we weren't very close. But when they came to see my grandfather, I saw sincerity in their eyes. "I didn't know Emma," Aunt Elaine's eldest daughter said, her voice breaking. "I can't believe my mother did this. I'm so sorry." My grandfather took Emma's hand, his gaze gentle but firm. "You're not to blame," he said, "but live differently. Don't let greed guide you." I stood there watching that moment, feeling a spark of hope that not all of my family had lost their hearts. In the weeks that followed, my grandfather gradually recovered at Greenwich Hospital. Every day Ava and I visited, bringing his favorite foods and the old business books he used to read to me when I was a child. Watching him, I saw life slowly returning. His white hair was neatly trimmed, his gaunt face began to regain color, and his sharp eyes, the eyes that once guided an empire, shone again. But I knew that the scars in his heart, like those in mine, would never fully fade. One spring afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the hospital room window, my grandfather called Ava and me to sit by his bedside. He took my hand, his voice low but strong. "Tanner," he said, I've lived long enough to see what money can do to people. I planned to put my wealth into a charitable foundation before I was locked away, and now I'm going to finish that." I nodded, unsurprised. That was my grandfather, always putting human values above money. "Want you to help me," he continued. "I'll return to the company briefly to set things in order, but after that, you'll manage this foundation." I was stunned, unsure how to respond. "Grandfather," I said, my voice trembling, "I'm not sure I'm up to it. I'm just an event planner." He smiled, the warm smile I remembered from our fishing trips by the lake. "Tanner, you have the right heart. That's what matters most. I trust you." Ava squeezed my hand, her eyes filled with pride. "You can do this, Tanner," she whispered. "I know you'll do it well." Their words were like a flame igniting my resolve. I nodded, feeling as if a great responsibility had been placed on my shoulders, but also an honor I couldn't refuse. In the summer of 2024, my grandfather returned to the Wells conglomerate, if only briefly. He appeared at the Manhattan headquarters, his white hair striking in a perfectly tailored suit, his sharp gaze undimmed by his captivity. Employees, from secretaries to executives, looked at him with a mix of awe and astonishment. He worked tirelessly, meeting with lawyers, auditors, and partners to finalize the transfer of most of the company's assets into a charitable foundation named after him, the Frederick Wells Foundation. The foundation would support education, healthcare, and community projects for those most in need. I stayed by his side, learning every step, from negotiating with investors to ensuring the foundation operated transparently. "Tanner," he said during one meeting, "remember, money only matters when it helps others stand up." When my grandfather officially retired for the second time, he entrusted me with managing the foundation. I stepped away from my event planning company, handing it over to a trusted colleague, and poured my heart into the foundation. Every day I worked with nonprofits, meeting people the foundation helped, from children receiving scholarships to patients getting medical support. Each smile, each thank you, made me feel I was fulfilling my grandfather's dream. I lived and worked the way he taught me, transparently, sincerely, and never letting greed lead the way. One day, while reviewing the foundation's financial reports, a letter arrived at the office. It was a simple white envelope, but the handwriting on it made my heart clench. My father's, sent from prison. I opened it, each line cutting into me. "Tanner," he wrote, "I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I was blinded by greed, and I hurt my father and you. I only hope one day you can understand my reasons." I finished reading, folded the letter, and tucked it into a drawer. I didn't respond. Not because I was angry, though the anger was still there, but because I didn't know what to say. The man who was once my father was now just a shadow of the past, and I didn't want that past to pull me back. One autumn afternoon, Ava and I returned to the Greenwich estate. The house, once a symbol of wealth and power, now felt different. The false wall on the first floor had been completely removed, and the secret room was now an empty space, converted into a small library at my grandfather's request. We stood in front of the house, looking at the oak trees, casting their shade, feeling as if a great weight had been lifted. Ava held my hand, her eyes sparkling in the sunlight. "We did it, Tanner," she said. "Your grandfather is proud of you." I smiled, squeezing her hand. "Not just him. I'm proud of you, Ava. Without you, I don't know what I would have done." Standing there, I thought about the lessons this journey had taught me. I learned that taking action, no matter how difficult, is the only way to face the truth. I learned that trusting those who love you like Ava, like my grandfather, is the greatest strength. And I learned that blood isn't always what makes a family. Family is the people who stand by you, even when the world turns its back. My grandfather taught me that, and I will carry that lesson for the rest of my life.